Kieran MacLeod had never seen waves as violent as the ones that crashed against the Flannan Isles on that bitter December morning in 1900. The 28-year-old lighthouse keeper gripped the railing of the relief vessel as it struggled toward the remote Scottish islands, his stomach churning not just from seasickness, but from an inexplicable dread that had been growing stronger with each mile they travelled from the mainland. The Northern Lighthouse Board had sent him to investigate why the Flannan Isles light had gone dark 3 days earlier, leaving ships to navigate the treacherous waters without guidance. Captain Morrison, the grizzled sailor piloting their vessel, had been unusually quiet during the journey, occasionally muttering what sounded like prayers under his breath in Gaelic whenever the lighthouse came into view. "Never seen anything like it," Morrison finally spoke as they approached the rocky landing. "Light's been burning for near 2 years straight, and Thomas Marshall ain't never missed a signal in all his time as head keeper. Something's gone terribly wrong on that cursed rock." As Kieran stepped onto the slippery stone pier, the silence hit him like a physical blow. Lighthouses were supposed to have sounds, the creaking of machinery, the voices of keepers going about their duties, the constant hum of maintenance work. Instead, the only sound was the relentless crash of waves against granite cliffs and a strange, almost musical whistling that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. The lighthouse tower loomed above him, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. Kieran had worked at 7 different lighthouse stations throughout Scotland, but none had ever felt so ominous, so fundamentally wrong. The very air around the structure seemed thick and oppressive, carrying with it a metallic taste that reminded him of blood mixed with salt. As he climbed the steep path toward the lighthouse quarters, Kieran noticed something that made his skin crawl. Carved into the rocks along the pathway were symbols he didn't recognise, spirals and crosses intertwined with what looked like ancient Celtic runes. They appeared old, far older than the lighthouse itself, and they seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly luminescence even in the grey daylight. The lighthouse keeper's quarters stood eerily intact, as if the 3 missing men had simply vanished mid-task. In the kitchen, Kieran found an unfinished meal, still sitting on the table, porridge congealed in bowls, tea grown cold in cups, and bread left half-cut on a wooden board. The scene was so ordinary, yet so profoundly disturbing in its sudden abandonment, that Kieran felt his hands begin to tremble. The logbook lay open on Thomas Marshall's desk, the final entry dated December 12th in shaky handwriting that seemed to deteriorate with each word. Storm winds from the west. James heard the singing again last night. Donald refuses to tend the upper gallery. Claims the light calls to something beneath the waves. I fear we are not alone on this island. The old stories were true. They come when the tide is highest, when the ancient stones sing their forgotten songs. Kieran's blood ran cold as he read the entry. What singing? What old stories? He had worked with Thomas Marshall before at the Bell Rock Lighthouse, and the man had been steady, reliable, completely rational. For him to write such seemingly delusional words suggested something had driven him to the edge of sanity. A systematic search of the lighthouse revealed more disturbing details. In James Ducat's room, Kieran found pages torn from a Bible, all containing references to the sea, drowning, and resurrection. The pages had been arranged in a circle around a crude drawing of the lighthouse, with lines drawn from the tower down into what appeared to be underwater caverns filled with human figures. Donald MacArthur's quarters contained the most unsettling discovery of all. Every mirror in the room had been shattered, and the pieces arranged in intricate patterns on the floor. Among the glass shards, written in what looked suspiciously like dried blood, were Gaelic words that Kieran could barely make out. Nator istecht ris an chith mara. Do not listen to the sea spirits. As evening approached and Kieran climbed the spiral staircase to light the beacon, he began to understand why Donald had refused to tend the upper gallery. With each step higher, the air grew colder, and a sound became increasingly audible, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the lighthouse, as if the structure itself was breathing. As Kieran lit the massive Fresnel lens at the top of the lighthouse, the humming sound intensified dramatically, transforming into what he could only describe as singing. Dozens of voices harmonizing in a language he didn't recognize, but that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to something primal in his brain. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark waters, and in its path, Kieran saw shapes moving beneath the surface. At first, he convinced himself they were seals or dolphins, but as the light made its second rotation, the truth became horrifyingly clear. Human figures were swimming in impossible formations deep below the waves, their pale bodies moving in perfect synchronization with the mysterious singing. They seemed to be rising toward the surface, drawn by the lighthouse beam like moths to flame. Kieran stumbled backward from the lens, his heart hammering against his ribs. The official reports had mentioned nothing about the unique properties of this particular lighthouse. But now he understood why the board had been so desperate to restore its operation. The light wasn't just a beacon for ships, it was a summoning signal for something far more ancient and terrible. The singing grew louder, and Kieran could now make out individual voices within the chorus. With a jolt of terror, he recognized one of them, Thomas Marshall's distinctive baritone, the same voice that had guided him through countless night shifts at Bell Rock, was now part of this unholy choir, rising from the depths. As he listened in frozen horror, James Ducat's tenor joined the harmony, followed by Donald MacArthur's rough bass. The three missing lighthouse keepers were still here, somewhere in the black waters surrounding the island, and they were calling to him. Their voices carried an irresistible compulsion that made Kieran's feet begin moving toward the lighthouse stairs without his conscious direction. He found himself descending step by step, each footfall bringing him closer to the entrance that led to the rocky shore. By the time Kieran reached the lighthouse door, the singing had become overwhelming, a sound so beautiful and terrible that tears streamed down his face, even as every instinct screamed at him to resist. Through the open doorway, he could see phosphorescent trails in the water, where the submerged figures swam in hypnotic patterns, their movements spelling out ancient symbols that hurt to look at directly. Fighting against the hypnotic pull of the voices, Kieran grabbed the doorframe and forced himself to look away from the mesmerizing patterns in the water. That's when he noticed the carved symbols on the lighthouse stones were glowing brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the otherworldly chorus. The entire structure seemed to be resonating with the supernatural frequency, as if the lighthouse itself was some kind of massive tuning fork, designed to amplify the call from the depths. Somewhere in his terror-clouded mind, Kieran remembered the stories his grandmother had told him about the Flannan Isles, how they were once called the Seven Hunters and were considered sacred by the ancient Celts. According to legend, The islands were portals where the living could communicate with those who had drowned in the surrounding seas. The dead supposedly waited in underwater cities, calling to the living to join them in their eternal vigil beneath the waves. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The lighthouse hadn't been built here by accident. Someone had known about the island's dark history and had deliberately constructed the beacon to serve as a conduit between the world of the living and the realm of the drowned. The missing keepers hadn't been victims. They had been chosen, called to serve a purpose far older than maritime safety. As this understanding flooded through him, Kieran saw movement in his peripheral vision. 3 figures were emerging from the churning waters at the base of the lighthouse, their waterlogged forms climbing the rocky shore with unnatural grace. Even in the dim light reflected from the beacon above, he could make out their faces: Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, their skin pale and bloated, their eyes reflecting an otherworldly luminescence. They moved in complete silence, except for the water that streamed from their sodden clothes and hair, creating small pools wherever they stepped. Their expressions were serene, almost beatific, as if they had found some form of peace in their aquatic transformation. But when Thomas Marshall looked up at the lighthouse, and his eyes met Kieran's through the doorway, the smile that spread across his waterlogged features was anything but peaceful. "The tide calls, brother," Thomas spoke, his voice carrying the same resonant quality as the underwater chorus. "The old compact must be honoured. One keeper for each lunar cycle. One soul to tend the light that guides the drowned home." Kieran slammed the lighthouse door shut and threw the heavy iron bolt into place. But even through the thick wooden barrier, he could hear the waterlogged footsteps of the 3 drowned keepers climbing the stone steps toward the entrance. Their voices had joined the supernatural chorus that seemed to emanate from every surface of the lighthouse, creating a symphony of the damned that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. Racing up the spiral staircase, Kieran's mind desperately searched for some way to break the hold these entities had over the lighthouse. In the lens room, surrounded by the brilliant beam that continued to sweep across the dark waters, he found Thomas Marshall's final logbook entries that he had missed during his initial search. The pages revealed the horrifying truth. The lighthouse keepers hadn't been the first victims. "The old keeper Macpherson warned me before he walked into the sea," Thomas had written, in increasingly erratic handwriting. He said the island demanded its tribute every 50 years when the planetary alignment allowed the drowned to return. The builders knew this when they erected the lighthouse in 1899. They needed a permanent beacon to maintain the bargain with whatever sleeps beneath these waters. The entries went on to describe how Macpherson had served for 49 years, watching over the light and feeling the core grow stronger with each passing season. When his time came, he had walked willingly into the churning waters, knowing that his sacrifice would protect ships and lives for another generation. But something had gone wrong with this cycle. The 3 new keepers had all been taken at once, breaking the ancient pattern and throwing the supernatural balance into chaos. A thunderous pounding on the lighthouse door below interrupted Kieran's reading. The drowned keepers were no longer content to wait. They needed him to join them immediately to restore the broken compact. Through the lens room windows, Kieran could see that the water around the island was now alive with phosphorescent activity. Hundreds of drowned souls were rising from the depths, their spectral forms creating an underwater aurora that bathed the lighthouse in sickly green light. The pounding intensified, and Kieran heard the ancient iron bolt beginning to give way under supernatural force. Soon, the drowned would be inside, and they would drag him down to join their eternal vigil beneath the waves. But as he watched the otherworldly display in the waters below, Kieran began to formulate a desperate plan, one that might break the cycle forever, even if it cost him everything. The lighthouse door exploded inward with a sound like thunder, and Kieran could hear the wet, squelching footsteps of the drowned keepers ascending the spiral staircase. Their voices called to him in harmony, speaking words in ancient Gaelic that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and speak directly to his soul. "Come to the eternal depths, brother. The sea forgives all sins, washes away all pain. Join us in the peace of the drowned." But Kieran had discovered something crucial in the final pages of Thomas Marshall's log. The lighthouse wasn't just a beacon, it was a prison, designed to contain the supernatural forces that dwelt beneath the Flannan Isles. The lens system had been specially crafted using techniques from medieval alchemists, its crystal elements arranged in patterns that created a binding circle of light. As long as the beacon burned continuously, the drowned souls remained trapped in their underwater realm. The missing keepers had made a fatal error by allowing the light to go dark for 3 days. In that time, the supernatural bonds had weakened, allowing the drowned to break free and claim new servants. But if Kieran could restore the lighthouse to its full intensity and perform the proper ritual described in Marshall's notes, he might be able to reinforce the prison and save future keepers from the same fate. The waterlogged figures appeared at the top of the stairs, their pale faces twisted with an emotion that seemed caught between anger and sorrow. Thomas Marshall stepped forward, his voice echoing with the authority of the depths. "You cannot fight what has been ordained for centuries. The compact must be maintained. One keeper must always tend the light from below, ensuring the beacon never fails." "Then let it be me," Kieran said, his voice steadier than he felt, "but not as your prisoner." He lunged toward the massive lens apparatus, his hands finding the focusing mechanisms that controlled the beam's intensity. As he began adjusting the complex array of mirrors and prisms, the lighthouse beam grew impossibly bright, its radiance transforming from the usual white to a brilliant, supernatural silver that seemed to burn with the light of the moon itself. The drowned keepers shrieked in unison, their forms beginning to waver as the enhanced light struck them. But instead of banishing them, Kieran was doing something far more dangerous. He was using the lighthouse as it was truly meant to be used, not as a prison, but as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The enhanced lighthouse beam pierced through the December storm clouds and illuminated the entire archipelago with supernatural radiance. Kieran could see the true scope of what lay beneath the Flannan Isles. Vast underwater cities populated by generations of the drowned, their phosphorescent inhabitants moving through coral-encrusted streets, and kelp-draped towers in an endless dance of the dead. As the silver light intensified, something extraordinary began to happen. The drowned souls that had been trapped in the depths for centuries started to rise toward the surface, not with hunger or malice, but with something that looked almost like gratitude. Kieran realized that the lighthouse had never been meant to imprison them. It was supposed to guide them home, to whatever realm awaited beyond the mortal world. The 3 waterlogged keepers stood transfixed by the beam, their expressions shifting from predatory hunger to peaceful recognition. Thomas Marshall's voice, when he spoke again, carried none of the otherworldly compulsion from before. "You understand now, don't you? We weren't taken by force. We heard the call and answered willingly, but we misunderstood our purpose. We thought we were meant to serve as guardians, keeping the living away from the realm of the drowned. But the real purpose," James Ducat continued, his voice gaining strength as the silver light bathed him, "was to serve as guides, helping lost souls find their way to final rest. The lighthouse keepers were meant to be psychopomps, shepherding the dead across the threshold between worlds." Through the lens room windows, Kieran watched in awe as thousands of spectral figures began ascending from the depths. Sailors who had perished in shipwrecks centuries ago, fishermen lost to sudden storms, children who had drowned while playing too close to treacherous currents, all of them rising toward the silver beacon, that would finally show them the way to eternal peace. But maintaining this level of supernatural energy was taking its toll on Kieran's mortal form. He could feel his life force being drawn into the lighthouse mechanism, his soul becoming part of the vast machinery that bridged the gap between life and death. Unlike the previous keepers, however, he understood what was happening and accepted it willingly. "The cycle is broken," Donald MacArthur said softly, his form already beginning to fade as the silver light carried him toward whatever lay beyond. "No more keepers will be called unwillingly. The lighthouse will tend itself now, drawing power from those who choose to serve as guides for the lost." As dawn broke over the Flannan Isles, the supernatural silver radiance of the lighthouse began to fade, settling into a steady, natural glow that seemed somehow more peaceful than any beacon Kieran had ever tended. The massive exodus of drowned souls had ended, leaving the waters around the island clear and calm for the first time in centuries. The ancient compact had been fulfilled, not through forced servitude, but through willing sacrifice and understanding. Kieran found himself standing alone in the lens room, but he was no longer entirely human. His physical form had become translucent, existing somewhere between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. He could feel the presence of countless other lighthouse keepers who had made similar choices throughout history. Men and women who had understood that some duties transcended mortality and had willingly taken up the eternal watch. The lighthouse would continue to function, but differently now. Ships passing in the night would see its light and find safe harbour, but lost souls wandering the boundary between life and death would also be drawn to its beacon. Kieran would serve as their guide, helping them find peace and closure before moving on to whatever awaited beyond the mortal realm. When the relief vessel arrived later that morning, Captain Morrison found the lighthouse in perfect working order, its beams steady and strong. But there was no sign of Kieran MacLeod anywhere on the island. The only evidence of his presence was a final entry in the logbook, written in a hand that seemed to shimmer between ink and light. "The mystery of the Flannan Isles has been solved, but the story is far from over. The lighthouse stands as a bridge between worlds, tended by those who chose to serve beyond death. Ships will find safe passage, and the lost will find their way home. The keeper's vigil continues, not in chains of duty, but in bonds of compassion. Let no one mourn for those who chose this path. We have found a purpose greater than life itself." Years later, sailors would report seeing a figure in the lighthouse windows during the worst storms. A tall silhouette that seemed to glow with its own inner light. They said he would raise his hand in greeting to passing ships, and those who saw him felt an inexplicable sense of peace and protection. The Flannan Isles lighthouse had become more than just a navigational aid. It had become a sanctuary for both the living and the dead, watched over by a keeper who had chosen eternity over mortality. Decades passed, and the legend of the Flannan Isles lighthouse grew among the maritime communities of Scotland. Ship's captains would tell their crews about the phantom keeper who watched over the waters, and young sailors would look for his glowing figure during their first passages through those treacherous seas. What they didn't know was that Kieran's influence extended far beyond the lighthouse itself. The silver light that had once bridged the gap between worlds had left its mark on the very fabric of reality around the Flannan Isles. Other lost souls, drawn by stories of redemption and peace, began appearing in the waters near the lighthouse. Kieran found himself guiding not just the drowned, but spirits from across centuries, plague victims from medieval times, soldiers from forgotten wars, children who had died far from home. Each soul he helped cross over strengthened the beacon's power, creating a growing network of spiritual energy that stretched across the North Atlantic. Other lighthouses began reporting similar phenomena, keepers glimpsing figures in period clothing, mysterious entries appearing in logbooks, and an inexplicable sense of being watched over by benevolent presences. The Northern Lighthouse Board, though they would never admit it publicly, began selecting their keepers more carefully. They looked for men and women with certain qualities: empathy, spiritual sensitivity, and most importantly, the ability to accept mysteries without demanding rational explanations. These new keepers would occasionally report strange occurrences, but they also noted that their lighthouses never failed, their beacons never wavered, and ships in their vicinity seemed to navigate with unusual precision, even in the worst weather. On the centennial anniversary of Kieran's transformation, something extraordinary occurred. The lighthouse beam, which had maintained its steady glow for decades, suddenly intensified to the supernatural silver radiance it had displayed that fateful night in 1900. For 3 hours, the light could be seen from the Scottish mainland, and every ship within 100 miles reported experiencing the most peaceful voyage of their careers. In that brief window, the boundary between worlds became permeable once again. Families separated by death were able to say their final goodbyes. Lovers torn apart by tragedy found moment of reunion, and children who had passed too young were able to offer comfort to their grieving parents. When the silver light faded back to its normal intensity, it left behind a sense of closure and peace that would linger in the collective memory of the Scottish maritime community for generations. The lighthouse stands to this day, its beams steady and unwavering, watched over by a keeper who chose duty over death and service over salvation. And sometimes, when the moon is dark and the seas are rough, passing ships report seeing not one but 4 figures in the lighthouse windows. Kieran MacLeod and his 3 predecessors finally united in their eternal purpose of guiding the living safely home and helping the dead find peace in whatever lies beyond.